In a seemingly peaceful nursing home, dark secrets hide behind smiles. When an exemplary caregiver reveals her cruel side, a frail elderly woman and her determined grandson find themselves in a quiet battle for justice. A story of courage, pain, and the power of a truth that demands to be heard. Are you ready to uncover what happens when the masks fall? Clara was a 34-year-old woman who had dedicated her life to caring for the elderly in what seemed like the perfect nursing home, where residents could spend their final years with dignity and comfort. She was always kind and patient, at least when the families of the residents were watching. Clara had an easy smile and kind words for everyone. To anyone who observed her, she was the ideal caregiver, almost perfect. The families of the elderly trusted her without question, and her colleagues admired her dedication. To them, Clara was the person who made the nursing home a better place. But no one knew the darkness Clara hid behind her kind facade. She had endured a lot of suffering when she was younger. Since the age of 12, she had cared for her ailing mother all by herself. Her childhood and teenage years had been consumed by this responsibility, while other kids her age lived their lives normally. Clara never had time for herself. She never went out with friends, never dated anyone. Even in her illness, her mother had never shown gratitude or affection. To her mother, Clara had always been an obligation, and that sense of being trapped had festered into bitterness inside her. When her mother finally passed away, Clara thought she could move on. But the years of pain and resentment followed her. She chose to work as a caregiver for the elderly as a way to turn her experience into something useful. However, the job constantly reminded her of her own past and everything she had suffered. Every elderly person she cared for brought her back to that burden she had once carried alone. Deep down, Clara despised the constant feeling of reliving her painful story every day. Seeing the elderly dependent on her care brought back the weight of responsibility that had consumed her for years. When no one was watching, when the lights in the hallways dimmed and the visitors had all gone home, Clara's mask would drop, and in those moments, her anger and frustration would surface in ways that few could imagine. Among the residents was Helen, a 78-year-old woman with a sharp mind but a body that no longer obeyed her. She needed help with almost everything, from getting up in the morning to using the bathroom. Helen had once been a strong and independent woman, but age and illness had taken that from her. Still, she tried not to let it bring her down. She loved to talk and always tried to maintain a good sense of humor, even in the face of difficulty. When Clara first began taking care of her, Helen thought she was in good hands. At first, Clara seemed so attentive and caring, but it didn't take long for Helen to realize that something was wrong. When they were alone, Clara was not the same person. She became cold, impatient, and sometimes even cruel. Small acts of neglect began to pile up. Clara would grip Helen's arm too tightly when helping her out of bed, ignore her requests for help, or give her medications late. The worst, however, were the words. Clara, always speaking in a quiet voice so that no one else could hear, would say terrible things to Helen. "You're a burden. Just in the way. Weak. Useless. Just like my mother." These words, whispered like venom, hurt more than any physical act. Helen didn't understand why Clara was like this, but she sensed that the caregiver was carrying a deep pain of her own. For Helen, it was difficult to believe that the same Clara, with her calm demeanor and sweet words in front of families and other staff members, could be so different when they were alone. Helen began to observe more closely. She noticed that Clara knew exactly when to be harsh, always avoiding the gaze of others. Helen also saw that Clara didn't treat all the residents the same. Some elderly people received her care with more patience, while others, like herself, became targets for Clara's hidden anger. Every day, Helen's fear grew. She knew something was wrong but didn't know who to turn to, and even if she told someone, who would believe her? Clara was seen as the perfect caregiver, and Helen was just a fragile old woman. The thought that no one would take her seriously made her hesitate. But, at the same time, Helen knew she couldn't endure it much longer. Clara seemed to become more aggressive with each passing day, as if the anger inside her was building up. Even so, Helen resisted. She was afraid, but she didn't want Clara to know just how much her words and actions hurt her. She tried to stay strong, or at least pretend to be, But as time went on, the abuse became more frequent. Clara knew exactly how to avoid being caught. Her behavior changed completely when anyone else was around, and Helen knew that if she tried to tell someone, they wouldn't believe her. Clara was seen as the ideal caregiver, and Helen, just a fragile old woman. Despite everything, Helen decided she couldn't stay silent forever. She began paying closer attention to the times when Clara mistreated her, the things Clara said, and the actions she took. Helen believed that, at some point, the truth would come out. She just needed someone who was willing to listen and believe her. Meanwhile, Clara continued her routine, keeping up the appearance of a dedicated caregiver. She prided herself on her ability to hide what she truly felt and did. For her, every elderly person she mistreated was just a way to release the frustration and anger she had been carrying for so many years. And the best part was that no one ever suspected. Everyone thought she was a saint. Clara enjoyed the sense of control it gave her. She felt like she was finally in charge of her own life, even if it meant causing pain to others. Clara had her routine carefully calculated. She knew which times were free from supervision, which cameras to avoid, and always kept her mask of kindness intact for anyone watching from the outside. To the families of the residents, she was the dedicated caregiver, always ready to meet any need. The praise and trust she received from the families fed her ego. "It's such a relief to know my mother is in good hands," they would say, and Clara would respond with a false smile, feeling more in control than ever. Time went on, and Helen, growing weaker and more fearful, struggled to find a way to protect herself. But with each passing day, Clara became more confident, more assured that no one would ever uncover what really went on behind the closed doors of the nursing home. For Clara, the suffering of others was just a way to ease the pain she carried within herself. But Helen knew she couldn't withstand it much longer. Even as her strength dwindled, she refused to give up. Clara, in her arrogance, didn't realize she was setting the stage for her own downfall. She believed herself to be untouchable, but Helen knew that the truth always finds a way to come to light. She just needed to wait for the right moment. Lucas had always been a devoted grandson. Ever since he was little, he spent hours by his grandmother Helen's side, listening to her stories and absorbing the wisdom she shared. When Helen moved into the nursing home, Lucas was worried, but he knew it was the best option. His busy life and work responsibilities made it impossible for him to care for her full-time. The nursing home provided the specialized care she needed. However, with each visit, something began to feel off. His grandmother, who had always been full of life and energy, seemed more withdrawn, more distant. At first, Lucas chalked it up to age. After all, Helen was 78, and her body wasn't as strong as it used to be. But over the months, he began to notice things that unsettled him. Helen, who used to chat eagerly during their visits, now answered his questions with brief responses. Her once bright eyes seemed distant, lost in thought. More than that, Lucas noticed bruises on her arms and legs, small but noticeable. When he asked her about them, Helen would brush it off, saying she had hurt herself trying to get up. Lucas, concerned, suggested she ask the caregivers for more help. "That's what they're here for, Grandma. Don't try to do everything by yourself." Helen would nod in agreement, but Lucas could tell she wasn't being completely honest. The bruises appeared more often. At first, Lucas believed they could be accidental. After all, elderly people bruise easily. But the frequency and size of the marks started to disturb him. He began to notice that during some of his visits, Helen seemed uncomfortable, almost as if she were hiding something. She avoided eye contact, and whenever he mentioned Clara, the caregiver, Helen would quickly change the subject. Lucas started to wonder if he was being paranoid. After all, Clara was well regarded by everyone. Every time he visited, Clara seemed attentive, always smiling and ready to help. She never left Helen without assistance and always appeared patient and kind. In fact, Clara made a point of greeting Lucas warmly and chatting about Helen's care, always assuring him that his grandmother was in the best hands. But despite her reassurances, something inside Lucas just didn't feel right. During one of his visits, while Clara was tidying Helen's bed, Lucas noticed that his grandmother seemed particularly tense. Helen sat in her wheelchair, her hands tightly gripping the armrests, and Clara was talking casually about Helen's recovery from a recent cold. Lucas listened, but his eyes were fixed on his grandmother. There was no smile. Lucas wasn't worried about the cold. It was the fear he sensed in Helen that troubled him. Clara, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed, talking lightly as if everything was perfectly normal. When Clara left the room to retrieve something, Lucas took the opportunity. Kneeling next to his grandmother's wheelchair, he spoke quietly, his voice full of concern. "Grandma, are you really okay? You can tell me if something is wrong?" Helen hesitated. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away with the corner of her blanket. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't worry about me. These things, they come with age." Lucas wanted to believe her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He knew his grandmother well enough to sense that she was hiding something. The rest of that day, Lucas couldn't stop thinking about the strange tension he felt during his visit. The excuses Helen gave, the bruises, her distant behavior. It all pointed to something bigger. He loved his grandmother deeply and knew that she wasn't telling him the whole truth. Meanwhile, Clara continued her routine at the nursing home. She knew the schedules of every resident's family members, knew exactly what to say and how to act to seem attentive and caring. Her confidence grew with each passing day. No one suspected a thing. She controlled the environment, manipulating situations to her advantage. To her colleagues and the families, Clara was the perfect caregiver. Even the staff who worked with her didn't notice her darker side. Clara was always able to avoid any situation that might raise suspicion. When someone was watching, she slipped back into her role as the sweet, dedicated caregiver. One of those colleagues was Martha, a younger caregiver who was dedicated to her job and treated the residents with genuine care. For Martha, this work wasn't just a job, it was a calling. She had always gone above and beyond to make the elderly feel safe and cared for, as if they were her own family. Martha had worked closely with Helen and had noticed some changes in her lately. Helen, who once loved to chat and laugh, had become more reserved and seemed more tired. Martha was concerned about the shift in her behavior, but she wasn't sure what was causing it. One afternoon, while taking a break in the small staff lounge, Martha overheard a conversation between two colleagues. They were talking about Clara, praising her professionalism and how she seemed to handle the elderly with such care. One of them mentioned that Clara was always the first to help in emergencies, and how much the residents' families appreciated her. Martha listened quietly, but couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. She had noticed a few times that Clara could be abrupt with some of the residents, but she had never seen anything overtly concerning. However, the change in Helen's behavior had left her uneasy, and Martha decided to start paying closer attention. Over the next few days, Martha watched Clara's interactions with Helen more closely, but without drawing attention to herself. She noticed subtle things, a harsh tone here, an impatient look there. They were small, but for someone like Martha, who paid attention to the details, those small things added up. The tension between Clara and Helen was palpable, but no one else seemed to notice. Meanwhile, Lucas couldn't stop thinking about his grandmother. He started calling the nursing home more often, checking in on Helen's condition. Every time he spoke with Clara, she was as polite and reassuring as ever, always making sure to tell him that Helen was being well cared for. But Clara's words, no matter how comforting, couldn't ease the growing sense of dread Lucas felt. During one visit, Lucas noticed that Helen was quieter than usual. He could see fresh bruises on her arms, even more visible than before. "Grandma, what's going on with these bruises?" he asked gently, his concern clear. Helen, with a sad, forced smile, told him again that she had fallen trying to get out of bed. But this time, Lucas didn't believe her. He knew his grandmother wouldn't be so reckless, not in her current state. That day, when Clara left the room to fetch something, Lucas pressed her again. "Grandma, please, tell me the truth. What's happening? These bruises, they can't just be accidents. Something's wrong and I need to know." Helen looked at her grandson, and for a brief moment, Lucas saw a deep sadness in her eyes. But she quickly looked away. "Lucas, honey, you're imagining things. I'm fine, just getting old. There's nothing to worry about." But Lucas wasn't going to give up so easily. He left the nursing home that day with a heavy heart, but with a growing resolve. Something was seriously wrong. even if his grandmother was too scared or too proud to admit it. He knew he had to find out what was really going on, and more importantly, he had to protect her before it was too late. Days grew longer and heavier for Helen. What had once been a manageable routine had now turned into a daily battle. Clara, who at first had at least maintained a facade of care, was becoming more and more abrupt, impatient, and sometimes downright cruel. The mistreatment had become a regular part of Helen's life, and she lived in constant fear that things would get even worse. Clara would push her with unnecessary force, grip her arms until bruises formed, and seemed to take satisfaction in Helen's quiet suffering. Clara knew Helen wouldn't speak up. For her, Helen was just another reminder of her painful past, a patient who needed to learn to fear her. Each day, Clara became bolder, more confident in her ability to get away with it. She knew she was beyond suspicion. To the rest of the world, Clara was the perfect caregiver, always kind and attentive. Behind closed doors, she was someone entirely different. But Clara believed she was in control, believing no one would ever notice the truth. Lucas, on the other hand, was becoming more aware of the growing strangeness during his visits. He noticed more bruises on his grandmother's arms and legs, and the way she tensed whenever Clara entered the room. But when he asked his grandmother about it, she would insist, "I just fell again, Lucas. It's nothing." She would smile softly, but the sadness behind her eyes betrayed her words. It was in one of those moments that Lucas realized he couldn't just take her words at face value anymore. Something much darker was happening. His grandmother wasn't the type to hurt herself repeatedly, and the more she avoided the topic, the more Lucas suspected she was trying to protect him from something, or worse, someone. One afternoon, Lucas decided to drop by the nursing home without warning. He needed to know if something was really going on, and if Clara's behavior when she thought no one was looking was any different from what she showed to the world. Lucas walked through the halls, keeping his steps light, trying to blend in with the environment. The place seemed peaceful, quiet as usual, but Lucas knew appearances could be deceiving. Meanwhile, inside the nursing home, Clara continued with her routine. Every move she made was calculated. She knew the schedules of every family member, knew where the cameras were, and how to act when anyone was around. Clara took pride in her ability to manipulate the situation to her advantage. Her calm and nurturing behavior was a mask she wore effortlessly, and nobody suspected anything. That day, Lucas made his way to Helen's room and found her alone, sitting in her wheelchair, her hands resting limply in her lap. The sadness in her eyes was deeper than usual. He sat beside her and took one of her hands in his. "Grandma," he said softly, "I know something's going on. Please, you don't have to protect me. Just tell me what's really happening." Helen hesitated for a long moment. She had been carrying the weight of Clara's abuse for months, too afraid to speak out, too scared that no one would believe her. But looking into Lucas's concerned eyes, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would listen this time. With a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. "Clara, she's not what she seems, Lucas. She's cruel. She hurts me when no one's around. She pushes me, yells at me, calls me names." Her voice cracked as she continued, tears welling up in her eyes. "She says no one will believe me because I'm just an old woman, and she's the perfect caregiver." Lucas felt a mix of anger and heartbreak as he listened. His grandmother, the woman who had always been strong and full of life, had been enduring this torment in silence for months. He had known something was wrong, but hearing it from her made it all too real. He wanted to storm out, confront Clara, and put an end to it right then and there. But he knew that acting impulsively wouldn't solve anything. They needed proof, something solid to hold Clara accountable. "You're not alone, Grandma," Lucas said, his voice firm but gentle. "I'm going to help you. We'll figure this out together, okay? But we have to do it carefully. I don't want her to get away with this." Helen nodded, wiping away a tear, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of relief. Lucas was on her side, and that was enough for now. While this was happening, Martha had her own suspicions about Clara. Over the past few weeks, she had been watching Clara more closely, paying attention to how she interacted with Helen and the other residents. Small things had begun to stand out. Clara's harsh tone when she thought no one was listening, the cold look in her eyes when she was alone with Helen. Martha had always trusted her instincts, and right now, they were telling her something wasn't right. That afternoon, while Clara had left to take a call, Martha slipped into Helen's room to check on her. She found the elderly woman sitting quietly, her shoulders hunched forward, a far cry from the lively, talkative person she used to be. Martha sat down beside her. "Helen," she began, her voice soft but serious, "I've been worried about you. I know you keep saying everything's fine, but I just don't believe it. You don't seem like yourself, and I've noticed the way Clara is with you sometimes." Helen tensed at the mention of Clara's name. Martha noticed the shift immediately. "I want to help you, Helen," she continued, "but you need to trust me. If something's wrong, I promise I'll do whatever it takes to protect you." For a long moment, Helen stayed silent, her lips trembling as she fought back tears. Finally, she spoke, her voice shaking. "She's hurting me, Martha. Every day. She says terrible things, pushes me, grabs me too hard. She told me no one would believe me. I don't know what to do." Martha's heart sank as she listened. She had suspected something was off, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," Martha said firmly. "I'm going to help you. I'm going to make sure she doesn't get away with this." Martha knew she had to be careful. Confronting Clara directly might only make things worse. Clara was smart, and if she realized they were onto her, she might try to cover her tracks. But now that she had Helen's confession, Martha was determined to act. She wouldn't stand by and let Clara continue her abuse. Later that day, when Clara returned, there was an unspoken tension in the air. Helen, still shaken from her conversation with Martha, tried to avoid Clara's gaze. But Clara, ever perceptive, sensed that something had shifted. She could feel eyes on her, could sense that she was being watched more closely than before. Martha and Lucas both knew they had to move carefully. They had a responsibility to protect Helen and any other residents who might be suffering under Clara's care. But they also knew that taking down someone as manipulative as Clara wouldn't be easy. They needed to gather evidence, build a case, and strike when the time was right. And while Clara still walked the halls with an air of confidence, neither Martha nor Lucas would let her continue her reign of cruelty unnoticed. The tension inside the nursing home had been building since the moment Martha and Lucas began quietly investigating Clara. Clara, who once walked the halls with the confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable, had started to notice subtle shifts. The looks from other caregivers, the occasional whisper between Martha and Lucas. Something was off, and Clara could feel it. Still, she held on to her belief that no one could expose her. She had crafted her image too well, and in her mind, that made her invincible. But the control she thought she had was slipping away, even if she didn't realize it yet. Martha had been speaking with other staff members, piecing together information and listening for any signs that others had noticed something strange about Clara's behavior. More and more, her suspicions were confirmed. Clara had managed to keep her actions hidden for a long time, but cracks were starting to show. Lucas, after hearing his grandmother's heartbreaking confession, had become even more determined to protect her. He visited more frequently now, checking on Helen and keeping a close eye on Clara. He knew that a direct confrontation wouldn't be enough. They needed solid proof, something that could leave no doubt about Clara's abusive behavior. One afternoon, Lucas arrived at the nursing home unexpectedly. He had made a habit of visiting at different times to see if he could catch Clara off guard. As he walked through the halls toward his grandmother's room, he spotted Clara helping Helen from the dining area back to her room. He noticed the way Helen's body stiffened in Clara's presence, the way she seemed to shrink under her caregiver's touch. It was then that Lucas saw it. Clara, with a scowl on her face, yanked Helen's arm roughly as they walked. It wasn't a gentle guiding motion. It was forceful, and Lucas could see the discomfort in his grandmother's face. His blood boiled, but he held back, knowing that his anger wouldn't solve the problem without proof. Clara, too confident in her own routine, didn't even realize that someone was watching her closely. As Lucas continued to observe from a distance, one of the nurses, Anna, also witnessed the moment. Unlike Lucas, Anna had worked alongside Clara for a while, but she had never seen this side of her so openly. Clara's roughness with Helen shook Anna, and she immediately reported what she had seen to Martha. Martha listened intently to Anna's account. "This is it," she thought, her heart racing. It wasn't definitive proof yet, but it was a start. Anna had no reason to lie, and now they had a witness to Clara's mistreatment. Martha knew they needed to act fast, but carefully. That same afternoon, Martha and Lucas took their case to the director of the nursing home. At first, the director was hesitant. Clara had always maintained such a spotless reputation. "Are you sure there isn't some misunderstanding?" he asked, trying to rationalize what he was hearing. But Martha and Lucas were adamant. They had Helen's account, their own observations, and now the testimony of another staff member who had seen Clara mistreating Helen firsthand. The director couldn't ignore them anymore. An internal investigation was launched immediately. Clara was called into the office for a formal meeting. She entered the room with her usual air of professionalism, but something about the tension in the room set her on edge. The director, along with Martha and Lucas, sat across from her. Lucas's eyes bore into her, and for a brief moment, Clara felt her composure slipping. "What's this about?" she asked, keeping her tone calm and neutral. "We've received some troubling reports about your behavior toward Mrs. Helen," the director said, watching Clara closely. Clara forced a smile, trying to maintain her usual demeanor. "There's nothing to be concerned about," she said smoothly. "Helen is a difficult patient, but I've done my best to care for her. Sometimes these residents get confused, you know, but this time, Clara's excuses didn't work." The director continued, "We have several witnesses who say otherwise, Clara, including Helen herself." For the first time, Clara's mask began to crack. Her usual confident smile faltered, and her eyes darted toward Lucas, who hadn't said a word yet but was watching her with a cold, determined stare. "I don't know what you think you've heard," Clara said, her voice tight, "but I've been nothing but professional. You know how hard this job is. Sometimes, these people don't know what's good for them, and we have to make tough decisions." Martha spoke up, her voice steady. "What we saw wasn't care, Clara. It was abuse. And we're not going to let it continue." Clara's eyes narrowed, her calm demeanor slipping further. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Martha. You don't know what it's like to take care of these people every single day. You don't know the pressure." But Clara had already said too much. The director had heard enough. "Clara, we're going to conduct a full investigation. Effective immediately, you're suspended. We'll be reviewing the security footage and talking to more staff." Clara's face paled. "You can't do this," she snapped, the professional mask fully gone now. "I've done nothing wrong. I've given everything to this place." But the decision had been made. Clara was escorted out of the room, her protests echoing down the hallway. For the first time in a long while, she realized that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. As Clara left the room, Lucas finally spoke. "She won't hurt you again, Grandma. I promise." Helen, though still shaken, felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had lived in fear for so long, but now, with Lucas and Martha fighting for her, that fear was slowly being replaced by hope. Over the next few days, the nursing home conducted its investigation. They reviewed security footage, which, while limited, showed enough to confirm Clara's inappropriate behavior. Other staff members, emboldened by Martha and Anna's testimony, came forward with their own accounts of witnessing Clara's harsh treatment of Helen and other residents. The evidence was overwhelming. Clara's spotless reputation was shattered, and within a week, she was officially fired from the nursing home. But that wasn't the end of it. Lucas, determined to make sure Clara was held accountable, pressed charges against her for elder abuse. Other families, upon hearing what had happened, began to question whether their loved ones had also suffered under Clara's care. Clara, once so confident that no one would ever discover her secret, now faced legal consequences for her actions. Her fall from grace was swift and harsh. For Helen, life at the nursing home changed dramatically. With Clara gone, she no longer lived in constant fear. Her health slowly began to improve, both physically and emotionally, as she no longer had to endure the abuse that had haunted her for so long. The nursing home, under pressure to ensure this never happened again, began implementing stricter regulations and increased oversight of caregivers. Martha was promoted to a supervisory role, her dedication and bravery in exposing Clara recognized by the nursing home's administration. Lucas visited Helen more frequently now, making sure she knew she was never alone. The scars left by Clara's abuse would take time to heal, but for the first time in months, Helen felt safe. And in the quiet moments, when she sat by the window in her room, watching the world outside, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: peace. The days after Clara's suspension were filled with a new sense of tension in the nursing home. Clara's presence had always loomed over the place, but now that she was gone, there was a strange quiet in the air. The investigation was ongoing, and everyone knew that something big was about to happen. Though Clara had been removed, the damage she had caused, especially to Helen, would take time to heal. Lucas, now more determined than ever, visited his grandmother as often as possible. Each time, he saw her slowly starting to regain a little of the brightness that Clara had drained from her. But it wasn't an easy recovery. Helen was still shaken, still afraid, even though Clara was no longer there to hurt her. The emotional wounds ran deep, and the fear of not being believed had left scars that would take time to heal. During one of his visits, Lucas sat beside Helen, gently holding her hand. She had been quieter than usual, and he could sense the weight of everything she had been through still hanging over her. "Grandma," he said softly, "I know this has been hard, but I'm here for you. I'm not going to let anything like that happen again." Helen looked at him, her eyes soft but tired. "I know, sweetheart. It's just, I've lived with this fear for so long. It's hard to let go of it. I was afraid no one would believe me." Lucas felt a pang of guilt. He had almost missed the signs, and the thought of his grandmother suffering in silence for so long weighed heavily on him. But now wasn't the time for guilt. Now was the time for action. "We're going to make sure she doesn't get away with this," Lucas said, his voice firm. "Martha and I are working with the nursing home. They've already started looking into everything. Clara isn't coming back here." Helen nodded, but Lucas could see that she still carried the burden of doubt. Clara had done more than just cause physical harm. She had made Helen feel powerless, made her question her own worth. And that was something that couldn't be fixed overnight. Meanwhile, Martha had been working tirelessly to gather as much evidence as possible. She knew that the key to holding Clara accountable was building a solid case. Over the next few days, she spoke with more staff members, asking if they had noticed anything unusual. To her relief, a few of them had. Small details started to emerge. Comments that Clara had made, moments of impatience or cruelty that other caregivers had witnessed but hadn't reported at the time. One caregiver, named Julia, recounted an incident she had witnessed a few weeks earlier. Julia had seen Clara grab Helen's arm too roughly while helping her stand up, causing the elderly woman to wince in pain. "I thought it was strange at the time," Julia said, but Clara brushed it off, saying she was just helping Helen get steady. Though it wasn't the definitive proof they needed, Julia's story added another piece to the puzzle. Slowly, Martha and Lucas were building a case that was impossible to ignore. The more they learned, the clearer it became that Clara's behavior hadn't been an isolated incident. She had been abusing her power for a long time, and now they were finally able to see the full picture. But it wasn't just about Clara anymore. Lucas knew that other residents could have been suffering as well. He began talking to the families of some of the other elderly residents, carefully bringing up the topic in a way that wouldn't alarm them. He asked if they had noticed any changes in their loved ones, bruises, unusual behavior, anything that seemed out of place. A few families mentioned small things, complaints about rough handling, a change in mood, but none had suspected the full extent of what had been happening. Lucas's heart sank as he realized just how far Clara's influence had spread. It wasn't just his grandmother. Others had been affected too, and no one had known. It made him more determined than ever to make sure Clara was held accountable. One evening, Martha approached Lucas with an idea. "What if we request the footage from the security cameras?" she suggested. "The cameras don't cover all areas, but they do monitor the main hallways and some of the common areas. If Clara was rough with Helen or any of the other residents while moving them around, there might be something there." Lucas nodded, thinking it over. "It's worth a try," he agreed. "Even if it doesn't show everything, it could at least back up what we're saying." They presented the idea to the nursing home's director, who, after some hesitation, agreed to review the footage. The footage didn't capture any clear acts of abuse in Helen's room or during private moments, but there were a few clips that raised eyebrows. One clip showed Clara roughly guiding Helen down a hallway, her grip too tight and her expression one of impatience rather than care. It wasn't the smoking gun they had hoped for, but it was enough to show that Clara's behavior wasn't as gentle as she portrayed. As they continued to piece together witness accounts, footage, and their own observations, Martha and Lucas began to feel a growing sense of confidence. They were building a case that would be hard to ignore. It was no longer just about exposing Clara. It was about making sure no one else in that nursing home would ever suffer the way Helen had. And then, a breakthrough. One of the other residents, an elderly man named Mr. Daniels, had overheard Clara during one of her outbursts. Though he struggled with his memory, Mr. Daniels had vivid recollections of hearing Clara speaking harshly to Helen, using words that were far from professional. She called her useless, Mr. Daniels said during a conversation with Lucas. Said things no one should say to someone as kind as Helen. This was the final piece they needed. Armed with the testimonies of other staff members, the footage, and Mr. Daniels' account, Lucas and Martha returned to the director. "This is enough," Lucas said firmly. "Clara needs to be held responsible for what she's done." The director, seeing the mounting evidence, had no choice but to agree. Clara would not be coming back. The case was turned over to the authorities, and Clara faced charges of elder abuse. The investigation revealed that her cruelty had gone unchecked for far too long, and now she would face the consequences of her actions. For Helen, knowing that Clara would no longer have the power to harm anyone else brought some peace, but the road to recovery was still long. She had spent months under Clara's care, and the fear and humiliation she had endured would take time to heal. But now, with Lucas by her side, and Martha ensuring that the nursing home implemented stricter protocols to protect residents, Helen could finally begin to feel safe again. Lucas, though relieved that Clara was being brought to justice, couldn't shake the guilt he felt for not realizing what had been happening sooner. "I should have known," he said to Martha one evening after visiting his grandmother. "You couldn't have known," Martha reassured him. "Clara was good at hiding it, but you helped bring her down. That's what matters now." The nursing home, shaken by the revelations about Clara, began to change. New policies were put in place, and caregivers were given additional training to ensure that nothing like this could happen again. Martha, promoted to a supervisory role, made it her mission to keep a close eye on the staff and ensure that every resident was treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. And Helen, though still fragile, began to regain her strength. The atmosphere in the nursing home had shifted in the days following Clara's official dismissal. The investigation into her abusive behavior had uncovered more than anyone had expected, and the weight of her actions hung heavy over the facility. But for Helen, Lucas, and Martha, there was a sense of closure beginning to form. Clara was no longer there, and the grip of fear that had taken hold of Helen's life was finally starting to loosen. After Clara's removal, Helen was able to breathe a little easier. Lucas visited her almost every day, bringing small gifts and stories to brighten her mood. The tension that had once dominated her face slowly began to fade, replaced with soft smiles and a quiet relief. Though the memories of Clara's cruelty were still fresh, Helen was no longer trapped by them. Lucas sat with her one evening, holding her hand as they looked out the window of her room. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden light across the room. "How are you feeling, Grandma?" Lucas asked, his voice gentle. Helen squeezed his hand lightly and smiled. "Better, sweetheart. Much better. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again, but now, things are starting to feel normal." Lucas felt a surge of relief hearing those words. It had been a long road, but knowing his grandmother was on the path to healing made all the effort worth it. Clara, meanwhile, faced the consequences of her actions. The charges of elder abuse brought against her were serious, and with the evidence Lucas and Martha had gathered, her chances of escaping punishment were slim. During the trial, Clara's past came to light. Her years of caring for her sick mother, the frustration and resentment she had bottled up, and how it had all exploded into cruelty toward the residents she was supposed to care for. Clara's defense tried to paint her as a victim of her own circumstances, but the judge saw through it. Trauma, no matter how deep, was no excuse for what she had done. Clara was found guilty on multiple counts of elder abuse. The verdict brought a wave of relief to the families of the residents she had mistreated, and most of all, to Helen and Lucas. Justice had been served. Clara was sentenced to prison, where she would have time to reflect on the damage she had caused. For Lucas, the verdict was bittersweet. On one hand, he was glad that Clara would never hurt anyone again, but on the other, the pain his grandmother had endured still haunted him. He had come so close to not noticing, to letting Clara's abuse go unchecked. The guilt lingered, but Martha often reminded him that he had done what mattered most. He had stopped Clara and protected his grandmother when it counted. Martha had also seen changes in the nursing home following Clara's trial. The facility had been shaken by the revelations, and the administration was quick to implement new policies to prevent anything like this from happening again. Caregivers received more training, and stricter oversight measures were put in place. Martha, now in a leadership position, made it her mission to ensure that every resident was treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. Life in the nursing home slowly returned to a new kind of normal. Helen, once fragile and afraid, started to regain some of her old spirit. She would sit by the window in her room, chatting with Lucas or Martha, smiling more often than she had in months. The heavy shadow that had hung over her was lifting, and with each passing day, she felt a little more like herself. On a sunny afternoon, Lucas arrived for one of his regular visits. He brought a bouquet of flowers, knowing how much his grandmother loved fresh blooms. As he entered her room, he found Helen sitting in her wheelchair by the window, the sunlight casting a warm glow over her. "Hey, Grandma," Lucas greeted, placing the flowers on her bedside table. "How are you feeling today?" Helen turned to him, her smile soft but genuine. "I'm feeling good, Lucas. Better than I've felt in a long time." Lucas sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. For the first time in what felt like forever, he saw the light returning to her eyes. The fear that had once consumed her was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. His heart swelled with gratitude that his grandmother had come through the darkness and was now finding peace. "You know," Helen said after a moment, "I didn't think I'd ever feel like this again. I thought I'd spend the rest of my days afraid, waiting for the next thing to go wrong. But you didn't give up on me. You listened, and you believed me when no one else would have." Lucas squeezed her hand, his throat tight with emotion. "I'm just sorry it took me so long to see it. I should have known sooner." Helen shook her head, her eyes full of understanding. "No, Lucas, you were there when I needed you most. That's what matters." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the past slowly dissolving in the warmth of the present. Outside, the garden was in full bloom, and the sounds of birds chirping filled the air. It was a moment of peace that Helen had longed for. As the weeks turned into months, Helen's health began to improve. Though the scars from her time under Clara's care would never fully fade, they no longer held her back. She moved through her days with a renewed sense of hope, knowing that she was safe and cared for. Martha continued her work at the nursing home, but her role had evolved. She was now seen as a leader, someone who not only cared deeply for the residents, but also made sure that the staff held themselves to the highest standards. She had earned the respect of her colleagues and the trust of the families, and she carried the lessons from Clara's downfall with her every day. Lucas, too, found a new perspective on life. He had learned how precious time with his grandmother was, and he made sure to never take it for granted. Each visit, each conversation, felt like a gift, and he cherished every moment they spent together. In the end, the nursing home became what it was always meant to be, a place where the elderly could live out their days with dignity and peace. The dark chapter with Clara had closed, and in its place was a new story, one of healing, strength, and the power of family. As Lucas left the nursing home that evening, he paused outside, looking back at the building. He had gone through so much to protect his grandmother, and now that justice had been served, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The future was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure: Helen would never have to live in fear again. And for that, he was endlessly grateful.